A woman was found dead in her own home, and within the first few months of the investigation, police had nearly 100 suspects, but they still couldn't find the killer. That went on for 8 years until detectives received a highly unexpected tip that turned the entire case around and helped reveal a truth almost no one saw coming. Linda Halverson was born on June 16, 1952, in Minneapolis. Her parents had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Linda was especially close to her older sister. They loved playing together, spending time outdoors, and riding skateboards. As she got older, Linda became more and more active. She would go running in the mornings, swim whenever she had the chance, and she even rode horses. When she was 18, she married a man named Charlie. They had known each other since childhood. Every year, Linda's parents rented a small country cabin, and the whole family spent most of their summer there, while Charlie's parents were the ones who owned the place. 2 years after the wedding, Linda and Charlie had a son. But eventually, the marriage fell apart. Charlie had served in Vietnam, and over time, he increasingly turned to alcohol to drown out the memories of what he had been through. That caused serious problems in their relationship. So after 7 years, Linda decided to file for divorce, and she kept custody of their child. 4 years later, she started dating a man named Robert, and they had a son together. But that relationship didn't last long either. Soon after the boy was born, Linda and Robert split up, and she was left raising 2 children on her own. Another 4 years passed, and Linda met a man named John. The two of them got married and moved to California. But 2 years later, they decided to divorce, and Linda returned to Minneapolis. Not long after coming home, she started talking to her first husband, Charlie, again. By then, their son had grown up and moved out, while Linda was raising her younger boy on her own. In the years they had been apart, Charlie had managed to deal with his drinking problem, and he and Linda admitted that they had never stopped loving each other. In 1991, the year that would have marked 20 years since their first wedding, they got married again, and just a few months later, they had a daughter. The four of them settled in a small, quiet town called Big Lake. Over the next few months, Linda devoted all of her time to caring for her daughter and her youngest son. It seemed like their family finally had a fresh start and a happy life ahead of them. But then, one day, everything changed. On February 24th, 1992, when Linda was 39, the morning started the way it usually did for her and her husband. Charlie woke up early and left for work, while Linda stayed home to look after their daughter, who was less than a year old at the time. Her 9-year-old son had gone to school, so Linda and the baby were supposed to spend the first half of the day alone. At around 4 p.m., police received a call from Charlie. In a shaking voice, he said he had just found his wife murdered, and officers headed to the house. According to Charlie, he had come home from work like usual and found Linda's son, who had just recently gotten back from school, along with her daughter, who was in her playpen. Charlie noticed that the baby was still wearing the same clothes she had been in early that morning when he had said goodbye to her. That struck him as a little strange, because quite a bit of time had passed. Even stranger was the fact that Linda was nowhere to be seen, and her son said he hadn't seen his mother since coming home from school. Charlie added that he had called the house several times from work, but Linda hadn't picked up. At the time, he assumed she was simply busy and didn't think much of it. But now, all of it was starting to worry him. He began walking through the house, looking for his wife, and finally made his way to the bedroom. When Charlie opened the door, he was met with a horrific scene. Linda was laying on the floor, partially covered with a bedspread, and a large knife was sticking out of her chest, right through the fabric. When police removed the bedspread, they saw that the victim had no clothes on. and that her body had a large number of stab wounds. As for the knife itself, investigators quickly determined that it had been taken from Linda's own kitchen. But despite the number of wounds, medical examiners concluded that the actual cause of death was strangulation. It appeared the killer had strangled her first, and only then stabbed her repeatedly. They also found signs of sexual assault and recovered the attacker's biological material. But at the time, they still weren't able to request a DNA analysis, since the technology was only just beginning to take hold. Experts also determined that Linda's estimated time of death was sometime between 8 and 10 a.m., just a few hours after her husband had left for work. By then, her son had already gone to school, and Linda was home alone with her baby daughter. Police checked every window and door, but found no signs of forced entry. There were also no obvious signs of a struggle inside the house, as if the victim had let the killer in willingly and hadn't expected an attack until the very last moment. Investigators also found no signs of robbery, except for one curious detail. The only thing missing from the house was the bedding from Linda's bedroom, the same room where her body had been found. Investigators thought the killer may have sexually assaulted her on the bed, then gotten rid of the sheets because he was afraid they might contain evidence. So everything pointed to the killer not only knowing Linda personally, but also feeling a deep hatred toward her. He had stabbed her many times after she was already dead, and had literally pinned the bedspread to her body. Forensic experts weren't able to find any unknown fingerprints on the knife or anywhere else, and they still couldn't run DNA testing on the killer's semen. So detectives focused on looking into potential suspects. For obvious reasons, from the very first hours of the investigation, they started taking a close look at Charlie. Police learned about his past problems with alcohol, and about the fact that he and Linda had spent many years apart. What made him look even more suspicious was that, while speaking with detectives, he suddenly said something on the lines of, "By the way, you'll probably find my fingerprints and DNA on the knife." According to him, he had touched the murder weapon, the blanket, and Linda herself when he found her body. Detectives found that quite suspicious. To them, it sounded like he may have deliberately said all of it right away, so he would have an explanation for any evidence they might find. Still, they were able to confirm that Charlie had been at work all day, and his coworker said that he hadn't left at all. On top of that, he agreed to take a polygraph test, and the examiner found no signs of deception. So Charlie was quickly removed from the suspects list, and before long, police had a new lead. News of what had happened spread instantly through the small town, which until recently had been considered a very safe place. Residents were following the investigation closely, and police kept receiving tips. One of them seemed especially interesting to detectives. A mail carrier came forward and said she had arrived at Linda's house at around 11:30 on the day of the murder. As she was putting letters in the mailbox, she saw a pickup truck pulling away from the house. Behind the wheel was a man in his 30s or 40s, with messy hair and a light-colored beard. Something about him struck her as strange, and then she noticed red marks on his hands that looked like scratches. Police created a composite sketch of the man and released it through the media, but they were never able to identify him. They couldn't find any other witnesses either. Linda's house was set quite far back from the other homes on the street, so none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything suspicious. At the time, investigators were looking into Linda's circle, and before long, they started focusing on Robert, the father of her youngest son. As we remember, Linda had started dating him after divorcing Charlie, but that relationship had eventually ended. Police learned that Robert had shown little interest in spending time with his son after the breakup, and over the years, the boy had barely seen him. But one interesting detail came up. Charlie had told detectives that Robert had suddenly contacted Linda just a few weeks before the murder. and said he had now decided he wanted to rebuild his relationship with the son. But Linda's reaction was far from positive. Not only did her son barely remember him, but Robert also had problems with alcohol and drugs. Linda didn't want the boy exposed to any of that, and she and Robert had several tense arguments over the phone. Detectives considered the possibility that Robert had killed Linda because she had refused to let him see their son. They brought him in for questioning, and almost right away, his behavior made him look even more suspicious. Robert claimed he hadn't spoken to Linda in several years, even though, according to Charlie, that was far from true. He also had no alibi. He said he had been at home, but no one could confirm it. Before long, he stopped answering detectives' questions altogether and hired a lawyer. Despite all of that, police had no actual evidence linking him to the murder, and without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Investigators didn't cross him off the suspect list and continued looking into his possible involvement for a while. But eventually, they had to move on. After that, detectives started looking into Linda's second husband, John, the man she had moved to California with. After speaking with people close to Linda, detectives learned that John had been fairly aggressive and quick-tempered. He would often start arguments, and once he had even hit Linda. It was after that incident that she filed for divorce and moved back to Minnesota. But detectives quickly found out that at the time of the murder, John was in California, teaching classes at the school where he worked, so he simply had no physical opportunity to commit the crime. Investigators didn't rule out the possibility that he could have hired someone to kill Linda, but they couldn't find a single piece of evidence to support that theory. Over the next several months, police looked into nearly 100 different men who, in their view, might have had some connection to the murder, but each time, it led nowhere. As time passed, Linda's case received less and less attention, and eventually, it went cold. Linda's relatives kept contacting detectives several times a month, but time after time, they got the same answer. There had been no progress in her case. The person fighting hardest for the truth was her older sister, Sandy. She constantly spoke with journalists, gave interviews, and did everything she could to make sure Linda's case wasn't forgotten. That continued until 1999, when a new sheriff took over the local department. He decided to take a fresh look at old unsolved cases, and Linda's murder was among them. By then, 7 years had passed, and DNA testing had become widely available across the country. Detectives sent the killer's semen sample to the lab, where experts extracted his DNA profile and began comparing it to the suspects. First, they compared it to the DNA of Charlie, Robert, and John. Detectives already had little doubt that 2 of the men were innocent, since both had strong alibis, but Robert was still under suspicion. As we remember, he had lied to police for some reason, claiming he hadn't spoken to Linda in several years, even though detectives knew they had actually talked on the phone just a few weeks before her murder. But his DNA didn't match the killer's sample either, so he was finally removed from the list. After that, investigators started requesting samples from the other suspects, more than 80 men in total, and all of them agreed to provide them voluntarily. Experts didn't find a single match among them, which meant that 7 years after the murder, police were still no closer to identifying the person responsible. When the killer's profile was entered into the FBI database, that didn't produce any matches either. As a final effort, the police department offered a $5,000 reward for information in the case, but that also failed to bring in any useful leads. In the end, the case stalled for another year, until it took a pretty unexpected turn. Police got a call from a woman named Angela, who said she had an idea of who might have killed Linda. According to Angela, she hadn't known the victim personally, but back then, she had been dating a man named Kent Jones. And soon after the murder, she started wondering whether he might have been the one behind it. To their surprise, detectives recognized the name right away, because Jones had been in the case files from the very first days of the investigation, just not as a suspect. He had been Linda's neighbor, living a little over half a mile from her house, and police had asked him a few routine questions. At the time, he said he hadn't seen anything and that he hadn't known the victim. Jones lived there with his wife and 4 children. He was a Boy Scout leader, regularly went to church with his family, and was seen as a respected member of the community. But according to Angela, in 1992, he had been secretly involved with her, and that was only the beginning of her story. Angela said that a few weeks after Linda's murder, she decided to bring it up with Jones since she knew he lived near the victim. He told her he didn't know Linda and had never seen her, but Angela noticed that his behavior changed suddenly. He clearly became angry, and she couldn't understand why. A few months later, the murder came up again during one of their conversations, and this time, Jones suddenly said he had actually spoken to Linda shortly before her death, and that he had also seen her jogging past his house in the mornings from time to time. Angela found the changes in his story extremely suspicious, and from that point on, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jones might have had something to do with Linda's murder. They broke up soon after that, but for a long time, Angela couldn't bring herself to share her suspicions with anyone. It was only 8 years later that she had finally found the courage to call the police. Detectives were interested in Angela's story and started looking at Jones much more closely. They learned that he had a conviction for insurance fraud, but that turned out to be only the tip of the iceberg. They had found multiple records showing that Jones had been accused of domestic violence. He regularly hit his wife and had even been arrested for it, but each time she refused to press charges. At one point, his wife was even hospitalized with a stab wound, and she told police she had accidentally fallen onto a kitchen knife that was sticking out of the dishwasher. Given the history of domestic violence in their home, police suspected her husband had been the one who stabbed her, but without her testimony, there wasn't much they could do. After going through all of that information, detectives started seriously considering his possible involvement. If Angela's story was true, then Jones had lied to police when he said he had never seen the victim, and that alone was enough to put him on the suspect list. Back in 1992, he had also told them he was home at the time of the murder, and his wife had confirmed it. But detectives had serious doubts about whether they could trust her word, given how many times she had forgiven her husband for hitting her and covered for him with police. Now, 8 years later, investigators went back to his house to ask the same questions again. He was still living there with his wife, and police began the conversation as carefully as they could. They said they were simply reviewing an old case and hoping to find some new information. Jones told them the same thing he had said 8 years earlier, that he had never spoken to Linda and didn't know her personally. But then, his wife immediately corrected him and said something along the lines of, "Don't you remember? Shortly before it happened, she came over to ask how she could sign her son up for the Boy Scouts." Police saw Jones's face twist with anger when his wife said that. Even so, he admitted that he had simply forgotten about that moment. He also added that he had seen the victim jogging along the road in front of his house a few times. After that, officers asked whether he had ever been intimate with Linda. There was a very specific reason for that question. The strongest piece of evidence in the case was the semen recovered from her body. If Jones denied ever having sex with her, and his DNA later matched that sample, it would leave him with almost no explanation and tie him directly to the crime. Jones said no, and detectives then asked whether he would be willing to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. Out of nearly 100 people, he became the first to refuse. So detectives immediately went to a judge for a warrant. As soon as the papers were signed, they went back to Jones, and this time he had no choice but to provide the sample. It was sent to the lab, and experts confirmed that his DNA matched the semen found on the victim's body. On July 25, 2000, Jones was arrested, and he continued to insist he was innocent. But when the case went to trial, he suddenly changed his story and claimed that he and Linda had actually been having a secret affair, and that they had been intimate the day before she died. In response, the prosecution turned to one of the state's leading experts, who examined the killer's semen sample and said that, based on the test results, it had to have been left no more than a few hours before Linda's death, not a full day earlier. To the jury, it looked like Jones was simply trying to reshape his story around the evidence, and they leaned toward the prosecution's argument. According to their version, Jones had initially wanted to pressure Linda into having sex, and may not even have planned the killer. They believe he had become interested in Linda after she came over to ask about getting her son into the Boy Scouts. According to the prosecution, that morning, Jones may have gone to her house and come up with some excuse to get inside. Maybe he said he wanted to discuss her son joining the Boy Scouts, or something along those lines. Then, in the prosecution's view, Jones began pressuring Linda for sex, but she refused. That was when he attacked her, sexually assaulted, and strangled her. After that, he took a kitchen knife and stabbed her repeatedly, making absolutely sure she was dead. In the end, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Jones was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 30 years, meaning not before 2030. Soon after that, Jones's attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that the judge had unfairly prevented them from pointing to other possible suspects. The defense believed the murder could have been committed by Robert, the father of Linda's youngest son, or by a man who went to the same gym as her and had been attracted to her. The judge, however, ruled that there wasn't enough evidence pointing to either of them, and barred the defense from mentioning them at trial. The appeals court spent a long time reviewing that issue, and in 2004, it sided with Jones. His conviction was overturned, and he was granted a new trial. It began 2 years later, and Jones changed his story yet again. Before, he had claimed that he and Linda had been intimate the day before the murder. Now, he insisted it actually happened on the morning she died. That way, his new version lined up with the expert's conclusion that the semen could not have been more than 24 hours old. The prosecution argued that there was absolutely no evidence Linda had been cheating on her husband, and everyone close to her insisted she never would have done something like that. In response, Jones said with a straight face that he was a skilled lover, and that women simply couldn't resist him. His attorneys even called his wife as a witness to confirm that claim, but she said that, in reality, Jones was not that good in bed at all. In the end, he was found guilty again, and this time, the court rejected the appeal that followed. So Jones had essentially lost his chance to challenge the conviction. But in 2015, something unexpected happened. Remember the expert who had determined that the killer's semen could not have been left a full day before the victim's death? His name was Michael McGee, and he ran a private practice out of his own lab. He had 30 years of experience behind him and had built a reputation as one of the most talented medical examiners in the state. But, over time, his work started raising questions, and that led to an independent investigation, which reached some very interesting conclusions. The people behind the investigation found that the expert's findings may not have been as accurate or reliable as they had once seemed. To put the problem in simple terms, it came down to this. McGee was accused of using methods to examine evidence that didn't have a strong enough scientific foundation, and their accuracy was seriously questioned by the scientific community. Take Linda's case, for example. McGee was the expert who placed her time of death between 8 and 10 a.m., and he did it using a test meant to detect a specific enzyme found in semen. In theory, that test was supposed to show how long the killer's biological material had been inside the victim's body, which would then establish the time of death. But the problem was that in this specific scenario, the test had very little proven reliability, and many experts believed it was completely unsuitable for analyzing evidence. That same enzyme is also found in the human body, which means the test can easily produce false results. So this wasn't outright fraud on Dr. McGee's part, but his use of questionable methods led to a review of every case he had worked on over the course of his long career. There were more than 200 of them, and in some cases, convictions even had to be overturned. Of course, Jones's attorneys didn't miss that opportunity and demanded that their client's conviction be thrown out. But in this particular case, it didn't lead anywhere. The problem for them was that the DNA analysis still showed that the semen matched Jones's biological sample, and there was no doubt about the accuracy of that test. As of now, he is still serving his sentence, and in just a few years, he will be eligible to request parole. But the chances of that request being approved are fairly low. And finally, it's worth noting that if Angela had never shared her suspicions with detectives, Jones could have continued avoiding punishment. His name had been in the case file since 1992, but all that time, no one had seriously considered him as a suspect until that tip came in. And without it, things could have stayed that way for a very long time. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.